Chapter 12. Breach. The morning after the dance. John stood outside of Team RWBY's dorm room once more, a turbulent storm of anxiety raging within him. The terrifying dread within his body nearly paralyzed him. He didn't want to be here. He didn't want to have to do this. But he had to. End of story. And so John raised his hand up and knocked. A muffled response yelling, "Coming," could be heard as after a few seconds, Ruby opened up the door. Ruby's eyes widened in surprise, obviously not expecting to see John so early in the morning. "Oh, hey John. You, want to talk to Weiss, I'm guessing?" Ruby asked, obviously a little uncomfortable after hearing about what happened last night after she left. John took a deep breath in and slowly exhaled to calm his nerves. "Actually, I wanted to talk to your whole team." Ruby raised a single brow, a bit confused. Yeah, sure. We're all here, I guess." She then opened the door wide to let John in as she turned to her team. "Hey guys, John's here. Said he wanted to talk to us." Team RWBY had just finished their morning routines, as they were already fully dressed in their combat gear, ready for today's mission selections. John felt supremely uncomfortable as four women were now staring at him in varying degrees of confusion, or at least in Yang's case, pity. Yang was in fact the first to speak up as John entered. "Hey John, how you doing, buddy?" Yang held back on her teasing remarks for now, instead attempting to go for a more older sisterly, if not a bit patronizing approach. "Yes, I'd like to know if you are alright as well," Weiss added in after, her still pushy attitude drawing a grimace from Yang. "I'd also like to know why you left in such a dramatic fashion last night. I thought we were having a good evening together." John's face distorted in pain as Weiss twisted the proverbial knife in his heart. "No. Being honest, everything is not alright. I need to confess something." The girls of Team RWBY all gave him concerned looks as John mulled over what to say. With their focus on him completely, John bit the bullet and said, "Weiss, you didn't actually want to go with me to the dance." Weiss scowled at the arc, her countenance covered in confusion. "What are you talking about?" I said yes. "I chose to go with you." John bit his lip hard enough that he tasted blood at Weiss's words. Being here was physically painful for him. Every fiber of his being was telling him to just turn around and walk out. To just never bring up what happened and just let Weiss and the others continue on in blissful ignorance. But he promised Pyrrha he'd tell the truth. Despite how much of a coward he wanted to be, he'd do it. He had to. "That's..." John struggled to get out. "That's only because I forced you to say yes," he finally admitted, his tongue already regretting the action as anxiety began to crush his heart. The reactions of Team RWBY weren't much better. Weiss and Ruby, the two members of the team more inexperienced with the opposite sex, only gave him bewildered scowls while Yang and Blake were immediately set on edge. Yang shot up, and not so subtly interposed herself between John and Weiss. "What do you mean by that?" Yang asked, her voice devoid of any mirth. John looked at Yang in the eyes, and could feel the flurry of emotions radiating off her. Suspicion, anger, confusion. Yang's feelings bled off her and John felt like he was going to be overwhelmed by them. The similar feelings he sensed from Blake were not helping either. As John was about to explain what was happening to him, he paused as he had a startling realization. He never told Team RWBY what was going on with his powers, their supposed source or their evolution. They knew that he was struggling to control his telekinesis, but anything more than that he kept within his team. John internally kicked himself, as he had even more to explain now. "Okay, wait, look." John held his hands up defensively in case Yang decided to deck him right there. "You guys remember how, in the beginning of the year, I didn't really have any control over my powers." Anger gave way to confusion as the members of Team RWBY glanced at each other. Yeah," Yang responded, unsure of what that had to do with anything. "Well, the thing is, while I have control of my telekinesis, that's not the only power I have now," John explained, eliciting surprised reactions from the all-girl team. "My powers are growing, I guess you could say. It started off as just telekinesis, but in the Forever Fall I gained the ability to heal myself, beyond what Aura is capable of, and I also gained an expertise in sword techniques despite not having any actual training in it. What? You have like a dual semblance? Yang asked with a raised eyebrow. Try triple or even quadruple. Jaune weakly chuckled. And I thought I was getting control of my powers, I really did. My team and Professor Goodwitch have all been really helping me train. But the thing is, I don't know what all of my powers are. And I realized last night, that I could affect people's minds as well. Weiss's jaw dropped and her eyes widened in horror as she realized what he was saying. Wait, are you telling me that? That you mind-controlled me? Jaune winced as Weiss yelled out. Yeah, I did. But I didn't mean to. I didn't even know that I could do it, I swear. And it wasn't even just you, I accidentally mind-controlled Cardin as well. That's why he's been leaving our teams alone. Silence reigned throughout the room. None of the girls knew what to say. They could only stare at Jaune wide-eyed. Ruby was the first to regain her bearings and speak. So that's why Weiss went with you, even though she wanted to go with Neptune. Feeling himself choke as Ruby said that, Jaune took a step towards Weiss and said, Weiss, I am so sorry. I didn't know any of this would happen. Please, I would never do anything to hurt you like. Smack. Jaune Ark's cheek hurt a lot, as did his ears as Weiss started to yell at him. But most importantly his heart hurt, having broken the trust of someone important to him. Get away from me. Weiss cried out as she stumbled back away from Jaune, her face etched not with anger but with fear. She was terrified of Jaune. But, that means everything last night happened because you wanted it to. No I didn't. I mean, yes, I did want it to happen, but I didn't want to force it to. Please, this was all just a terrible mistake. I stopped as soon as I realized what I was doing. Jaune exclaimed, reaching out for Weiss's hand to try and stop her from retreating. Don't touch me. Weiss screamed out, backing away even further. Weiss couldn't stop herself from shaking. She felt violated. Part of her could rationally understand that Jaune didn't mean it, and that he did stop as soon as he realized what he was doing. But the primal, instinctive part of her, it was screaming at her to get away from him. To be afraid of him. It was like her father, only worse. To have no control over herself, her actions, her future. It was her worst fear. Jaune worked his mouth open, but no words came out. What could he even say to try and fix this? To his surprise, Ruby came to his defense. Weiss, I know this is bad, but Jaune didn't mean it. And he is sorry. Sorry. You think being sorry is good enough? Weiss was borderline hysterical now. As she realized she was screaming, Weiss closed her eyes and took a deep breath, clenching her shaking fists. As she tried to regain some semblance of self-control, she turned to her partner. Ruby, I know Jaune didn't mean it. But I just can't accept it. I can't forgive him. Weiss's gaze fixed on Jaune, eyes starting to water. I can't forgive you, because I can't hate you for what you did. Something inside of me won't let me. I still feel what I felt last night. Our friendship that could have gone even further. Weiss didn't know what she felt. She felt betrayed by him, but still couldn't fight the feeling that she was drawn to him, attracted to him. As if they had some sort of bond that transcended their relationship. And how much of this my own feelings, and how much is just manipulation? Jaune couldn't respond. He made no attempt to even try to defend himself anymore. This was all his fault. Ruby looked like she was going to say something else to try and defend Jaune, when Blake cut her off. She's right, Ruby. Blake almost whispered out, barely loud enough for everyone to hear. You don't understand what it's like to be manipulated. To be lied to and controlled. To not know if what you're thinking is your own thoughts, or something implanted by someone else. While it wasn't the same situation, Blake couldn't help but think of Adam, her toxic ex-lover who more than easily gaslighted her every time he committed some terrible crime for the Fang. They're both right. Jaune slowly exhaled. I don't expect you to forgive me. I wouldn't. I just thought it was best that you knew the truth. Jaune let his head hang in shame. Just stay away from me. Weiss choked out as she walked past Jaune and out of the room. Yang and Blake looked at each other, and with a nod both decided to go after the heiress. Blake didn't bother saying goodbye to Jaune, while Yang placed a single conciliatory hand on John's shoulder before leaving as well. This left John, still looking at the ground in shame, alone with RWBY, who was still trying to figure out what to say. RWBY. John sighed, exasperated. I'm so sorry for everything. I know, RWBY trailed off. You did the right thing by telling us. And hey, it could always be worse. At least Weiss doesn't seem like she's going to sue you, or use her family connections to make you disappear or something. RWBY weakly joked. John let out an equally weak chuckle. Yeah, that's a real silver lining. Seeing the amount of pain and shame John was in, RWBY did the one thing she knew could possibly help. She walked forward and gave John a hug. John was startled that RWBY would even be willing to get this close to him, but soon found himself returning the embrace. Give Weiss some space and time, and I'm sure she'll come around. RWBY comforted, before looking him directly in the eyes, her own silver orbs somber and solemn. But that's only if you're able to get these new powers of yours under control. John returned the look with his own steel gaze. I will. I'll definitely learn to control them. Ark's promise. I'll hold you to that. RWBY smiled as she let go of John. Relieved that at least one of his friends didn't hate him, John decided to shift to a less agonizing topic. What about you? I heard about what happened last night in the CCT. You okay? RWBY shrugged. Physically, yeah. Emotionally, I'm annoyed that I let the bad guy get away, or bad girl I should say. Think she's related to all this White Fang business you guys have been investigating? RWBY nodded her head. Well, we don't have any actual evidence connecting them, but I feel it in my gut. I leaked some info to Professor Ozpin about some possible White Fang base locations, so hopefully we can take the fight to them when we go out on our mission. Makes sense. Speaking of which, we should probably go catch up with our teams. Don't want them picking our missions for us. John sighed as he exited the dorm room. Hopefully this will go better than our last field trip. RWBY facepalmed as she exited as well. John, why would you say that? That's bad luck. You did the same exact thing last time and you were nearly killed. When both leaders arrived at the amphitheater, they separated and went in search of their own respective squads. It didn't take long for John to find his teammates, loitering in the back of the auditorium along with the rest of Beacon students. In fact, it was almost too easy, as he felt that he could even sense where they were when he entered. He sighed, chalking up that development to his ever-growing list of powers. Another development caused him to pause as he approached his team. John felt pain in his stomach once more. Pain and hunger. John's eyes went wide. He thought the hunger had gone away. Why was it back? Dust. It even felt worse than before. Being in a room with so many others only seemed to amplify the feeling. Seeing John pause in the crowd, the rest of Team JNPR met him halfway. Hey John. Nora called out as their leader approached. How'd the talk go? John didn't say anything, and only showed them the bright red handprint on his cheek. Nora winced. That bad, huh? I probably got off light. John weakly commented, stifling down the ravenous hunger afflicting him. Don't worry John, we'll figure out what to do about this. Kira comforted as she stood next to him, placing a hand on his shoulder with a smile. John smiled and placed his own atop of hers. Thanks PYR. But all honesty, I'd rather think of anything else right now. Let's just listen to what Ozpin has to say and pick our mission. Purah's smile faltered for a brief second as she pulled back her hand and stood next to John at attention. It was at that moment that Professors Goodwitch and Ozpin had taken the stage. Ozpin began some kind of speech to encourage the diversity and individuality of the students from around the world. But John honestly couldn't care less. Between everything that just occurred with Weiss, his constantly evolving abilities, and his resurgent hunger, he had far too much on his mind. When the headmaster's speech was finished, the audience of students began to break apart, each going to different holographic screens to choose their missions. Taking a deep, meditative breath to regain control of himself, John turned to his team with a forced smile. So, any suggestions for what to do? Nora gave a noncommittal shrug, just happy to go somewhere where she can blow up Grim, while Pyrrha seemed more than content to simply follow the rest of the team's lead. Ren on the other hand, seemed to be mulling something over before speaking up. If possible, I would like to take a mission that goes to one of the border villages. Ren spoke up, earning a somewhat conflicted look from Nora. Such villages tend to be lower priority for huntsmen as they typically lack funding, and I think it would be good for us to help them. John could tell there was something more to that statement, even without his semblance telling him so. But, if John was entitled to more than a few secrets, so were his team. If Ren didn't want to talk about what was bothering him, John wasn't going to push. Sounds like a good idea. If there's no objections, let's go check the boards, John said as he tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy. It didn't take long for them to find such a mission. Shadowing a sheriff of the village of Blackford. It was a medium-sized village, not a tiny hamlet nor a sprawling metropolis the size of Vale. Located a decent distance south of Vale, so they would have to take a bullhead to travel there in good time. Villages such as Blackford had defenses such as walls and watchtowers, along with a local garrison of guardsmen or police. Normally these were enough for small grim incursions, but any large-scale attacks from bandits or grim typically required them to call for the aid of professional huntsmen. With a flick of his finger, John signed them up for the mission. And done. Says we're scheduled to leave tomorrow morning though, so I guess we have today to ourselves. John turned to the rest of his team. Anybody have anything they want to do to kill time? It seems that Team RWBY will be leaving for their mission today. Kira brought up, before wincing as she saw John's red slap mark once more. Though it may not be the best idea to say goodbye to them right now. Yeah, I can only take so much emotional damage in one day PYR. John weakly laughed. Well, all things considered then, I would like for all of us to talk in private, as I think I may have a better idea of John's semblance now. The rest of Team JNPR stared at the champion wide-eyed at her declaration. They quickly made their way back to the dorms where they could speak in private. So PYR, what's your theory? John asked, genuinely curious. Well, as you say, this is still only a theory. But after the events of last night, I believe John's semblance, or I should say the semblance of man that John dreams of, is control. Control. Nora parroted. What kind of vague power is that? It was the best name I could think of. Kira huffed. Regardless, it aptly describes what John can do. Whenever John uses his abilities, he is exerting his will over something. For example, his telekinesis is him exerting his will over an object, controlling it. Ren, now getting what Kira was talking about, nodded his head. In the Forever Fall, when you healed yourself, John, you said you were using your semblance to force your wounds closed, exerting control over your own body. And last night, what you did to Weiss. Kira continued as John whined at the reminder. That is an example of you exerting your will over someone else. John sighed, running his hand through his unkempt hair. That all makes sense. But there's still more questions we don't know. How many more powers do I have? How can I control the ones that I know of? How can I even train to not accidentally mind control someone? His frustration was reaching a boiling point as the hunger was brought to the forefront of his mind. Kira flinched when John raised his voice. Sorry, I don't have the answers for any of those questions. I just wanted to let you all know of my theory. John's anger quickly faded to guilt as he saw Kira shrink in front of him. Thus she's only trying to help him and he starts yelling. What was wrong with him? No, Kira, don't apologize. You literally did nothing wrong. I'm just being a jerk again. John sighed. No, this is a step in the right direction. We already know that my powers are tied to my state of being. It's affected by things like my emotions and the amount of focus I have. When I controlled Weiss, I let my emotions run rampant. I was afraid she was going to reject me, then elated when we were together in the dance. And when I controlled Cardin, it was anger, rage, just even hate. Both times I was hyper-emotional while telling them to do what I wanted them to. Then that means at the very least, your powers of manipulation are done when you attempt to exert your will over someone else while feeding off of the power of your emotions. Kira surmised, having already instantly forgiven John's outburst. I hate to say it, but this seems like it will require experimentation. If you can learn how to use this mind control power on command, you by default learn how not to use it. John grimaced. The idea of going out of his way to learn how to mind control people was hard for him to accept morally. But Purr's point made too much sense. Better the devil you know than the devil you don't, he supposed. I don't want it to, but your point makes too much sense. I don't like the idea of trying to mind control any of you though. As long as you don't try to make us do anything untoward, I don't see an issue, John. Ren responded. And if all of us are there, and you only control one of us, the rest can make sure nothing goes wrong. Yeah. Besides, think of all the good ways you can use this power, John. If Ren doesn't want to make us pancakes, you can just tell him to. Or you could convince Professor Ozpin to share his coffee stash with the rest of the students. Nora beamed. Nora, I don't think either of those would be a responsible usage of John's powers. Kira admonished. Yeah, Nora. No offense, but the last thing we need is you running around caffeinated. Who knows what would happen if you ever got your hands on some coffee? John shook his head with a small laugh as he imagined Nora trapezing through the multiverse thanks to a caffeine-fueled power boost. The laugh instantly faded as the pain of his hunger roared once more. John, are you all right? Kira worriedly asked, noticing John's change in demeanor. Yeah, I'm good. John regained himself. I think I just need to meditate for a while, be prepared for tomorrow's trip. You guys want to come with? Sure. I believe some meditation will be good in order to prepare us for tomorrow's mission. Ren responded, while the others voiced their desire to attend as well. And so Team JNPR left for the rooftops, with John silently praying he could somehow get the hunger under control before they left for their mission. Later that night, in the wee hours of the early morning, John twisted and turned in his bed, only barely within the realm of dreams. It was not often that John could sleep as he currently was, his rest plagued by memories or interrupted by hunger. But somehow he was able to put himself to sleep in order to prepare himself for the oncoming trials of their mission. His sleep was far from restful, however, as all he saw were nightmares. He saw himself, standing on Beacon's air docks, but there was something wrong. Soon smoke filled his lungs and brought water to his eyes while he could feel the heat of fire on his skin. Beacon was burning. Through the tears he could barely see the destruction around him. Bodies of students and Atlas soldiers littered the gardens and walkways, while Grim roamed free. John tried to move but couldn't, his body not reacting to his commands. He pushed to raise Crocia Morse, to fight to defend his school, when the sound of music and a bright glow woke him up. Eyes fluttering open, John saw that he was within his dorm room. Groggily, John reached out for his scroll which was producing the disturbance. Grabbing it, he scowled a bit as he saw that he was receiving a call from Ruby. Answering the call, John brought his scroll to his ear. Hello. Garbled noise was the only response he got before the call disconnected. Ruby? John asked, confused as to what was going on. John had a bad feeling about what just happened, and weighed his options. Ruby wouldn't call unless something was wrong, but it could also have just been a butt dial given the lack of actual dialogue. Also, according to the texts he traded with her earlier, Ruby's team was off in MT. Glen, and the only way they'd be able to get there would be by Bullhead, which were all closed down for the night. Not to mention his team still required their own rest for their mission. Looking at the time, it was about 5 a.m., earlier than he'd normally get up. It would be easy for him to just go back to sleep and catch another hour or two of rest, but his unease prevented him from doing that. The paranoia from the nightmare he just had wasn't helping either. It didn't seem like it was a memory of the dreadlocked man that he had seen before. It was definitely a beacon, but he didn't know what it meant. Did the dreadlocked man see Beacon get destroyed, or was this something else? He didn't have any answers. Slowly getting out of bed, John decided that he'd get ready and wake up his team as well. They'd be annoyed but they'd have to deal with it. He'd try and get in contact with Ruby again. Best case scenario, it was just an accidental call and he and his team would just be leaving for Blackford early. It was a little bit after 6 a.m. as Team JNPR slowly made their way to the air dock in the dawn's morning light. They were less than happy at having to get up so early, but followed their leader's command nonetheless. After some quick showers to wake up, and a moderate breakfast to fuel their day, John tried to call Ruby once more but couldn't get through. He was starting to get worried. John, I'm sure they're fine. Kira tried to assure her leader. You think? He asked unconvinced. It was probably a butt dial. Nora added on, the normal spring in her step gone as she was still tired in the early morning. Team RWBY has always performed exceptionally in the field. We should be focusing on our own mission. Ren tried to ease John's worries as well. John frowned. Something still felt off to him. Like the time he and Pyrrha almost went into that cave in the Emerald Forest during initiation. I don't know, guys. I just have a bad feeling about this whole thing. And those feelings are usually right. Pyrrha frowned. John eyed. Kaboom. A thunderclap was heard in the distance, a loud explosion coming from Vale. Smoke could be seen rising from within the city, as distant alarms began blaring. Soon, Beacon's own warning klaxons rang out. John resisted the urge to groan as his feelings were proven right. The alarms were for a breach in the city. Looking at the bullhead they were going to take to the village, John began barking out orders. We're changing our mission. Everyone on the bullhead, we're going to support Team RWBY. With silent acknowledgements, the members of Team JNPR moved to follow their leader's orders. As Ren passed John into the VTOL, John stopped him with a hand on his shoulder. Ren, we'll make it to that village another time. Ren only returned a silent nod. He knew that they couldn't ignore a breach within Vale, and he would do his job to stop the Grimm. Satisfied that Ren was on board both physically and mentally, John called out to the pilot. Take us into the city. Straight for the breach. The bullhead pilot acknowledged the orders and Team JNPR was on their way. John could feel the terror in the air as they approached the combat zone. Somehow, there had been a breach in downtown Vale. From the bullhead, Team JNPR could see dark clouds of smoke contrasting against the early morning orange sky. Vale was burning. Part of John couldn't help but remember his dream, of seeing Beacon burning around him. Was it some kind of prediction of today? Was the Grimm incursion going to be so bad that it'd reach even Beacon? John shook the thoughts out of his head. No, he won't let that happen. Whatever it takes, he'd stop this attack here and now. ETA 1 minute. Get ready to drop. John heard the pilot call over the radio. Hope you kids are ready for this. Once you go down there, air support won't be able to pick you up until the situation on the ground is under control. We'll be fine, John calmly stated as he opened the bullhead's side door. John closed his eyes and took a deep breath, taking the fear and negativity into him much like a Grimm would. He could tell it was affecting his powers. Whenever John meditated, he could always feel those around him. He saw the colors of their auras, and saw how everything they did rippled out through the darkness, affecting him and everything around him. It was like floating in a still pond, feeling the motions of other swimmers, letting the water flow over him and push him. But now the water was a torrent. It became a violent hurricane as those beneath him screamed and cried out in terror. John growled as he felt this surge threatened to consume him as well. The fear around him brought a rise of righteous anger within John, strengthening his powers. He would make the Grimm bleed for every soul they took today, for every life destroyed. And in the recess of his mind, he felt a twisted sense of joy. John's been having a hard day, and he was looking forward to blowing off some steam by killing Grimm. Nora. John commanded as he opened his eyes, the dropship now in position. Below he could see Team RWBY fighting off a massive horde of Grimm by a hole in Vale Street. Nora grew a savage grin and leapt out of the bullhead screaming, Nora smash! Crocea Morse telekinetically flew out of its sheath and into John's hands as the rest of Team JNPR jumped out as well. Soaring through the air, riding atop her warhammer, Nora Valkyrie made a dynamic entrance as she spun and brought Monhild down onto the head of a King Taijutsu, caving in its skull and killing it instantly. Gracefully, Nora backflipped off the Grimm and landed on City Street, where her three teammates landed beside her, weapons drawn. Go. John gave another one-word command that his team would follow to the letter. Nora and Ren rushed out first, focusing on the smaller creeps and Beowulfs. Nora's long reach crushing several Grimm with each swing, while Ren danced around and above the slower Grimm, using his martial arts to score kill after kill. As Renora thinned, the Horde Arcos focused on higher priority targets. Quickly spearing through two creeps, Pyrrha spun and threw Milo into the torso of an approaching Ursa, killing it instantly. Seeing that she was temporarily deprived of her weapon, several surrounding creeps charged her, only to be chopped down by a flash of steel as Crocea Morse flew through the air like a buzzsaw before returning to Jaune's hand. Recalling her own weapon with her polarity, Jaune and Pyrrha went back to back as they scanned for their next target. And the next target would quickly unveil itself to be a massive Deathstalker charging through the breach, easily as big as the one they had fought in the Emerald Forest. Despite the raging battlefield around him, Jaune could only smirk. His powers had grown much since the last time he fought a Deathstalker, and he was excited to test the difference. Pyrrha, immobilize it. I'll take it down, Jaune ordered. Roger. The champion charged forward without a moment's hesitation. As Pyrrha closed the distance, the Deathstalker gave a wide swing with its armored claw, intent on bisecting her completely. Not slowing in the slightest, Pyrrha dropped into a slide, the claw completely missing her as her greaves and shield sparked against the concrete, getting her beneath the grim. Once underneath, Pyrrha kicked herself back up, and with the momentum thrust her spear into the joint of the front right leg of the scorpion. She then pulled the trigger of her mechashift weapon, giving her the added speed to completely cut the limb off. The Deathstalker fell forward, collapsing at the unexpected maiming. The stumble was more than enough distraction for Jaune to leap into the air and land on the Deathstalker's back without worrying about the stinger, not that it would have hit him anyway. Not wasting a second, Jaune threw his sword, his powers guiding the blade to cut Deathstalker's stinger right off its tail. Reaching out with his telekinesis, Jaune then grabbed onto the stinger, and mirroring their tactics from initiation, drove the stinger right into the armored thorax of the Deathstalker. As the Grim began to spasm when its own poison started to course through its body, Jaune leapt into the air and with a telekinetic push, forced the stinger through the Deathstalker, impaling and killing it. Jaune landed beside his partner, and joined her in helping thin the horde of lesser Grim. But they were quickly losing ground. Sometimes, it was easy for Jaune and the other huntsmen in training to forget how terrible the Grim were when they could wipe out dozens in seconds. The true strength of the Grim wasn't in their individual strength, though there were exceptions to that, it was that the Grim were a flood. The fact that one huntsman could take down hundreds of Grim didn't really matter when their enemy was literally limitless. After decapitating another Beowulf, Jaune took a second to survey the battlefield. They were losing, that much was clear. Team RWBY looked exhausted. He had no idea how long they'd been awake for, but it appeared like they'd been battling non-stop for hours. Team JNPR was doing work, but they were only 4 people. Grim were getting past them and into the civilian population. Jaune could sense the individual life forces being snuffed out by the Grim, crying out in terror as they were forever silenced. Gritting his teeth, Jaune knew he had to put a stop to this. Cover me, he called out as Jaune dashed for the breach itself. Without a question, the rest of Team JNPR rallied behind Jaune, killing creeps, Beowulfs, and Ursa by the dozen as he ran towards Ground Zero. Even with just a cursory glance, Jaune could see that the damage was extensive. The breach itself was a massive sinkhole on one of Bale's streets, connecting to some kind of underground tunnel system. A subway, Jaune surmised based on the fact that there was a train car sticking out of the hole. The initial explosion damaged several nearby buildings as well, mostly stores and apartments, best Jaune could tell, and he could see a multitude of corpses within the ruins, killed either by the explosion or by the following Grim. Grimacing at the sight, Jaune ignored it and focused back on the breach. Sheathing Crocea Morse, Jaune extended out both his hands and began to focus. All around him, rocks, asphalt, and other debris began to slowly twitch, then drag, then float as Jaune reached out with the force. Quickly Jaune began filling the hole, hoping to stem the tide of Grim that continued to pour through. Just as quickly Ren, Nora, and Pyrrha formed a triangle around Jaune, killing any Grim that came near to prevent them from breaking his concentration. Progress was going well. Jaune worked fast to fill more and more debris into the breach, the smaller Grim unable to get through the literal tons of stone. In the distance he could hear the engines of dozens, if not hundreds of airships as the Atlas military was on the way, droids and huntsmen coming to reinforce them. But the noise was all muted for Jaune, as his tunnel vision was solely focused on repairing the breach. Suddenly, the ground shook. It was like the Grimm Zoo movie he saw, where every time the tyrant Grimm took a step off screen, it was more felt than heard. His team and Team RWBY felt it as well. Even the lesser Grimm around them seemed to cower and back down from whatever it was that was coming. John's danger sense spiked, and he barely had enough time to drop his telekinesis and yell to his teammates, "Get back." Not a moment later the breach exploded once more. Tons of stone and concrete flew into the air, smashing through nearby stores and apartment buildings. John fell to his knees, not only from the shock of the explosion, nor from having his concentration disrupted like that, but from the fact that he felt so many lives around him die in an instant. Dozens of civilians who were hiding in those buildings were crushed by the debris. But there would be no respite for John to recover, as from the wreckage of the breach, a massive, muscular, black-furred and armored arm burst through. The limb was huge, easily 20 feet long, and as the Grimm it was attached to burst through, two burning red eyes could be seen through an uncomfortably human-like Grimm faceplate. It was a Burringle. And not just any Burringle, but a King Burringle, an ancient Alpha Grimm that was at least 30 feet tall, and reinforced with spikes and heavy armored plates. And the King Burringle just reopened the breach like it was punching through tissue paper, lesser Grimm flooding out behind it. "Brothers, damn it, Nora!" John commanded, knowing she was probably the only one with the raw power to do damage to the Elder Grimm. "On it!" Valkyrie cried out as she slammed her hammer into the ground, propelling her forward and directly towards the ape-like Grimm. With a resounding crack, Monhild exploded upon the Grimm's chest, a cloud of pink suffusing the Elder Grimm in smoke. After a few seconds of silence, Nora turned back to her team with a savage grin, having just dealt a killing blow to an Elder Grimm, in one hit. It was then that a pair of massive arms shot out of the cloud and wrapped around the huntress. Nora didn't have a chance to scream before the burly arms began crushing her. Constricting around her, Nora could feel her bones cracking as the Grimm increased the pressure, overpowering the young woman. "Nora!" Ren cried out, charging right for the Elder Grimm with reckless abandon. The Mistralan boy had no chance as a pair of Beowulfs lunged at him, tackling him to the ground as he focused on saving his friend. "Ah!" Nora screamed as her aura broke under the gorilla's grip, no longer protected by the projection of her soul. John's eyes went wide as he saw Nora's own went white, foam forming at her mouth as the Grimm was breaking her in two. That thing was going to kill Nora and it was all his fault. His orders, his team, his responsibility. The feelings of fear quickly gave way to burning anger. That brother's damned Grimm was not going to hurt Nora. Not while he still drew breath. Anger took physical form as he gathered his semblance in his hands, crackling with power. "Get the hell away from her!" John roared as he extended both hands. But instead of simple telekinesis, a storm of lightning burst from his fingertips, striking both the Grimm and his teammate, the smell of ozone filling the air. John didn't know where the lightning came from and he didn't care. All he needed to do was save Nora. Lightning continued to stream from his fingers, burning and blowing away chunks of black flesh and white bone from the Grimm, the King Burringle roaring in pain. "Ah!" Nora screamed as the lightning hit her as well. A scream which turned to maniacal laughter as her aura levels started rising, and her eyes shot back to life. Power. Supercharged, Nora headbutted the Burringle, cracking its face mask while she broke out of its grip. Unlimited power. Nora cackled as she grabbed the Burringle by its fur on its collar and headbutted its face, again, and again, and again. With one final headbutt the Burringle fell backwards, its face a pile of blackened meat and bone, dissolving into fine mist. John soon fell as well, his body completely exhausted. It was a familiar feeling he was experiencing, but not one he had felt in a long time. It was the exhaustion from using up the entirety of whatever well of energy his powers drew from. John knew he'd be fine in a few minutes, but right now he was helpless. Kira ran up to the immobile John, standing over his body with her weapons raised. John could faintly hear her cries of concern, muffled by both his exhausted state and the rage of battle around them. Glancing up, John saw that Nora had run off, her hypercharged state causing her to berserk through the hordes of Grimm. Meanwhile, Kira continued to protect John as Grimm began to surround them. With a twirl she would spear 2 creeps, then shield bashing a Beowulf, the raw power behind the blunt strike killing the Grim. She became a blender, a tornado of blades and dust that shredded anything that approached her or her partner. In the distance, Jaune could see a cluster of creeps fly through the air, batted away by a swing from Nora's hammer still high off her lighting boost. Ren, having freed himself from the 2 Beowulfs, trailed behind his childhood friend, desperately trying to keep from getting overwhelmed as they continued to hack their way through the horde. Jaune wanted to stand and call them back, but found himself lacking the strength to do so. They were spreading too far apart, and as the distance between them was being filled with Grim so they'd be unable to retreat and give each other any meaningful cover. The pit in Jaune's stomach increased further as he knew something bad was going to happen, his prescient danger sense blaring in the back of his mind. His premonition came to pass when another wave of massive Grim lumbered through the breach while he was still unable to move. Ancient Deathstalkers, Betrayals, Ch.12, and more crawled their way out, further increasing the breach in size. Jaune could feel the hearts of his allies around him sink at the entrance of the Grim reinforcements. Reinforcements that couldn't have come at a worse time as Nora's lightning high had run its course, her injuries and exhaustion now catching up with her. All while Jaune was still unable to move. Helpless like a newborn babe, and the feeling sickened him. All of his training, all of his power, and he was still weak. Team RWBY made the first move. Launching themselves from their respective positions to try and take out the largest of the Grim, killing a betrayal as Weiss's ice froze its legs and RWBY took off its head. But the retaliation for that strike was instantaneous. A flock of Nevermore grabbed RWBY before she even had a chance to land, flinging her into a building, while the unending flood of Beowulfs enveloped Weiss. Young and Blake moved to relieve her, hacking their way through the lesser Grim, when a 2-headed Ch.12 slammed into them and knocked them back, cutting Weiss off. Pyrrha moved next. With a throw backed by superhuman strength, Pyrrha flung a Ko at the Grim jumping on Weiss, bisecting several of them and most likely saving the Hyress's life. But unfortunately Pyrrha didn't have time to recall her shield before a massive pincer slammed into her. The Deathstalker, moving forward unabated, hit Pyrrha from behind with its claw and flung her right into a nearby building. The impact of the claw alone shattered Pyrrha's aura, while the hit against the building knocked her unconscious. Pyrrha's body ragdolled as she fell to the ground, unmoving as the Deathstalker continued to approach her, looking to finish off its prey. Jaune tried to scream, to do literally anything to save his partner, but his body wouldn't obey. A group of piercing screams to his right stole his attention for a brief second, as he saw a pair of griffins breaking down a storefront where a small group of civilians were hiding. Locking eyes with one of the civilians, a terrified male deer faunus clutching a pair of similarly middle-aged humans, Jaune could see the faunus was begging him to help, regardless of how helpless Jaune was as well. Jaune couldn't avert his eyes as the group of civilians were mauled by the Grim, limbs, organs, and other viscera thrown into the air as the monsters tore apart their meal. Tears starting to flow down his cheeks, Jaune could only grit his teeth and clench his fists in the sight. Jaune failed them. He let them die because he wasn't strong enough to stop the Grim. He wasn't strong enough to control his own powers. He wasn't strong enough to get up and save his own partner, the person who cared for him the most. He hated everything about this. He hated the Grim for causing all this destruction. A small part of him hated Team RWBY for kicking whatever hornet's nest caused this whole situation. A much larger part of him hated himself. For being so weak, for being unable to protect anyone or anything, for having to be protected. He despised being weak almost as much as he despised himself. He needed to be stronger. He wanted to be stronger. But now he'll never have the chance. As Jaune buried his face in the dirt, wallowing in angst and self-loathing, he almost didn't notice as the sounds of battle around him ceased, the cries of death and desperation silenced into nothingness. Realizing something was wrong, Jaune looked back up, and saw that he was surrounded by darkness, much in the same way he was surrounded by the void when he meditated. Glancing around as much as his immobile body would allow, Jaune caught sight of a figure approaching him. Jaune sucked in a sharp breath as he watched a tall, black-robed figure, wearing the very same bone-white mask he still had within his locker. The figure strode up to Jaune, looking down upon him, and despite his masked visage, John could sense he wore a sneer across his face, similarly disgusted by John's weakness. "Wah, what?" John sputtered out, not understanding what was happening. The masked figure spoke, and John understood nothing. It sounded like a garbled mess of words and sounds, compressed and distorted by audio static and white noise. The noise grated John's brain, and then he felt a pressure, as if it was pushing something into his skull, which continued until the words soon became intelligible. "You seek what you already have." The voice spoke, mostly monotone with a hint of condescension. John quickly recognized the voice. It was the same voice that told him he needed to feed. The same voice that told him to break ice at the dance. I don't understand," John whispered, afraid of what this figure wanted. "Power. You have the power to save your friends already, but you are simply too afraid to use it. Because you are too much of a coward." The masked specter replied, annoyed at having to spell out his point for John. John felt an indignant rage at the masked figure's accusation that superseded his fear. "What are you talking about? If I had the strength, I would be using it. I just didn't have enough time to learn how to control my power." "Your excuses are as pathetic as you are," the figure spat out. "What you call control is just suppression. You have not tamed your power, merely run away from it. You have allowed yourself to fight with one hand, blinding yourself to the possibilities of the Force." The figure waved his hand and John began to levitate, constricted in a familiar telekinetic grip, and he brought John eye to eye with him. "Do not reject your emotions, your desires, your hunger. To do so will merely leave you weak and helpless, as you are now." The figure finished. John reflected on the masked figure's words. He knew at the very least he was right. John was always at his strongest when he embraced his emotions. When he was falling in initiation, when he choked out Cardin, when he fought the Terentatek, and even when he dueled Mercury. There was power in his darkest emotions, of that there was no doubt. But then John recalled the dreadlocked figure in his dreams, and the unrepentant cruelty he exuded. Was this power worth becoming like that? To see everyone around you as nothing more than worms to be stepped on. Sensing John's indecision, the masked figure spoke once more. "You must embrace it. Embrace your power, your dark side. For it will grant you the power to protect those you love. If you don't, you and your friends will merely become more corpses for the Grim to feed on, and my time spent on you will have been wasted." The figure's words struck John like a hammer. What was he hesitating for? The masked figure was offering John a way to save everyone from death. Why shouldn't he take it? If it's to save everyone else, John would be more than happy to shoulder the burden of this dark side. That's what a hero would do. "I'll do it," John resolutely spoke. He needed the power to save everyone. He'll do whatever it took to save them. Pay any cost. He will never be weak again. Nothing he loves will ever be hurt again. "Then rise, young Ark." The masked figure stepped back, releasing his grip on John, causing him to fall back onto the ground. "Rise, and let the hate flow through you. Let your hunger drive you. Do this, and you will have power the likes of which Remnant has never before seen." With that declaration, the noise and chaos of battle resumed around John, as he found himself back in Bale, lying on the ground unmoving. John could begin to move again, but it was still nowhere near his full power. Straining to push himself off the ground, John heard a growl as a young Beowulf stepped forward, lips curling up in a savage snarl. The Beowulf lunged, eager to sink its teeth into the huntsman's flesh, but was stopped with a yelp as John shot his arm out, physically grabbing the Beowulf by the throat. The Grim struggled and kicked, trying to flail its way out of his grasp, when it found itself surrounded by crackling red and black lightning. For the first time in its life, this creature of Grim, a predator of darkness, felt fear as the black and red energy began to course through it, and it began to feel weaker and weaker. The powerful, muscular limbs of the Grim began to wither and shrink, pristine bone plates became dull and cracked, and the bright, blood-red glow of its eyes began to dim as John force drained it. John stood as he lifted the Beowulf into the air by its throat, the Grim now hanging limp as it dissolved into dust. The Grim, a creature of pure darkness, a creature of pure dark side energy, fed John as he absorbed its very essence. John felt his energy return and his hunger start to sat, but it wasn't enough. He was hungry and he wanted more. John grew a savage grin as he realized what he needed to do. He needed to feed. All around John, a crowd of Beowulfs and creeps slowed their approach, unsure and somewhat fearful of what the young huntsman just did. John would not give them a chance to collect themselves. Extending out both hands, black and crimson lighting shot forth as he called forth his force drain, siphoning the pure dark side energy of the Grim and taking it into himself. As the Grim around him collapsed and died, John not only felt his hunger sat, but felt his own body strengthening. He felt his strength increase, his senses sharpen. It was an elated high that he'd never felt before. John's danger sense blared once more, stealing his attention away from his jubilation. His head snapped towards the sense, where he saw the Deathstalker still approaching the unconscious Pyrrha. John smiled as he wondered what the scorpion tasted like. With a telekinesis-powered leap, John appeared right on top of Deathstalker, preventing it from advancing any further. Before the scorpion could even have a chance to bring its stinger down on the young Ark, John focused his telekinesis into his fist, strengthening it as he punched through the chitinous bone armor and into the blackened interior. The Deathstalker squealed as John broke through its defenses, flailing and snipping towards him. Reaching out with his powers, John then began to drain the Grim from the inside. The Deathstalker's coloration began to shift from its pitch black to lighter and lighter gray as it shriveled and died. Meanwhile, John's powers were kicked into overdrive as he absorbed the Deathstalker's essence, years if not decades of cruelty and darkness entering his form. As the sheer amount of dark side energy threatened to overwhelm him, John extended his offhand and aimed it towards a nearby group of Grim. Letting his hate and disgust for the Grim flow through him, a massive storm of lightning burst from his fingertips, bolts of lightning disintegrating dozens of Grim in an instant. Simultaneously shooting lightning from his left hand while draining the Deathstalker with his right, John never thought he'd have this kind of power in the palm of his hands. He couldn't help but laugh as he charred Grim after Grim, each howling and yelping as they died a painful death. As the Deathstalker finally expired beneath him, John ripped his fist free and moved to his partner. Pyrrha was thankfully still alive, but unconscious. Luckily she showed no other obvious wounds, so she wasn't in danger of bleeding out. Looking around him, John saw that the immediate area was clear of Grim, all turned to ash by his storm of lightning. John knew he couldn't just leave Pyrrha here to get swarmed again, but he couldn't stay here and let the rest of the city get overwhelmed. Extending his senses, John felt hundreds of presences nearby, many radiating feelings of burning vengeance or hardened discipline. The huntsmen of Baal and the army of Atlas were finally there, and soon a squad of Atlesian soldiers airdropped beside him, scanning the area for threats. Grabbing the nearest blue tinted by the shoulder, John said, "Soldier. New orders. You and your team are to protect this huntress and bring her to safety." John bent this soldier's mind with his powers, no longer caring about the morality of such an action. He wanted his partner safe and didn't care if he had to sacrifice 1,000 Atlesian soldiers to do so. The soldier gave a blank look at John, before twisting and looking at the unconscious Pyrrha, then nodding and saying, "Yes, sir. We will defend this huntress and bring her to safety." Satisfied that the enthralled soldiers would get Pyrrha out of there, John turned and made his way back to where the combat was thickest. John could sense several familiar auras as he approached. Team CFBY and SSSN had joined the battle, while both Professors Port and Goodwich were also blasting their way towards the breach. John just grunted at their appearance and hoped they'd just stay out of his way. He wanted to let loose with his powers and would be annoyed if he had to hold back to prevent collateral damage. As John continued to move forward, he spotted another squad of Atlesian soldiers hiding behind some rubble, pinned down by a flock of Nevermores and griffins shooting feathers down from above. John resisted the urge to roll his eyes. These soldiers had training, aura, and all of the technological superiority of Atlas, and they were still fucking worthless. John had half a mind to just leave them there so he could focus on saving actually useful warriors. Ultimately, John decided to intervene. Worst case, he just had another opportunity to test his powers. As the Nevermores flung another volley of feathers, the Atlas soldiers hunkered down, hoping they wouldn't be skewered. As they hid, eyes clenched shut in fear, they waited for the inevitable impact and screams of pain from whatever casualties would be inflicted. After several seconds passed with no impact however, the soldiers opened their eyes and saw all of the feathers frozen in mid-air as Jaune intercepted them with his telekinesis. With a flick of his wrist, the feathers turned around and flew for the Grimm. Caught off guard by the reflection of their own attack, half of the Grimm were impaled by their own feathers. Immediately the survivors began evasive maneuvers, quickly identifying Jaune as the closest target and probable source of the attack. The surviving Griffins and Nevermores dive-bombed, dropping straight down to tear Jaune apart. They would never get the chance however, because as they flew down they froze in mid-air, caught within Jaune's telekinetic grip. The Grimm then clumped together as Jaune smashed them together. Effortlessly he broke their forms, snapping limbs, spines, and other bones, contorting them as he crushed them into a single ball of black ooze and broken body parts. Jaune then called upon his drain to siphon the darkness before it had the chance to dissipate. Jaune then heard a call of cheers as the Atlesian soldiers waved to him in thanks. Jaune scoffed and rolled his eyes. He didn't need the thanks and admiration of such weaklings. Without a second look Jaune turned and performed a telekinetic leap away. As he arched his way through the air, he spotted a familiar black and yellow duo currently locked in combat with a two-headed King Taijutsu. Blake and Yang were exhausted to be sure. Their movements were sluggish, their breathing heavy, and they both sported a series of cuts and bruises that meant their aura was probably low. Jaune knew that Yang had a tendency to bite off more than she could chew, but this was just getting asinine. He didn't know how long Team RWBY had been battling for, but considering the timing of his previous call, it must have been at least for several hours straight. The stupidity of the team was never more apparent to Jaune, as they still haven't chosen to fall back, needlessly putting themselves at risk. Jaune silently landed behind the King Taijutsu, Blake and Yang not noticing his arrival. As Yang rolled to the side, clumsily dodging a lunging bite from the white snake, Blake leapt forward and cut into the snake's head with her sword, knocking it back. The white snake recoiled in pain, retreating beside its black counterpart. Blake and Yang took their stances, preparing themselves for the retaliatory strike, when the King Taijutsu froze in place. Bumblebee dropped their guard slightly in confusion as the Taijutsu stopped moving. The confusion was dispelled as the Grimm began to float into the air, revealing Jaune arc behind it, both hands extended as he levitated it with his semblance. In a single motion, Jaune pulled apart his hands, tearing the snake in twain, split apart directly in the middle where the two monochromatic sides met. The two halves of the Grimm flailed uselessly as they bled black ooze, falling dead within seconds. The two girls felt their jaws drop at the brutal display of power. Dropping the Grimm corpse to the ground, Jaune casually walked up to Yang and Blake, a scowl adorning his face. Fall back to the Atlas defensive lines. You're in no condition to keep fighting, Jaune ordered. Yang took particular offense to that order and snapped back, "We're fine. We can keep going, there's still civilians out here who need help." Jaune let out a low growl. How could Yang be this stupid? He's out here, trying to make sure that they don't die, and she wants to keep risking her life from some random strangers. Jaune knew that their bleeding hearts would get them killed, so he decided to take matters into his own hands. Waving his hand, Jaune laced his words with the force and mind tricked both Yang and Blake. You want to fall back to the Atlas lines and get some rest. Yang scowled, but didn't immediately react. Her face contorted in confusion, her overwhelming strength of will naturally fighting back against the forced persuasion. Blake, on the other hand, seemed far more malleable to outside influence as her eyes glazed over with dumb acceptance. Considering her former position as a cult lackey, it didn't surprise him she was more easily affected. As Yang struggled internally to accept the orders, Blake grabbed onto her hand and said, "Come on Yang, we have to fall back to the Atlas lines, we need to rest." The coaxing from her partner was all Yang needed to fully accept the mind trick and follow the order. Without hesitation, the two women began to fall back, moving behind the lines of Atlas droids currently suppressing the Grimm. As they did so, a second surge of huntsmen and soldiers pushed forward. Jaune saw that Glinda was working to repair the breach itself, which meant that they just needed to clean up any remaining Grimm and the battle would be over. Seeing that the battle was close to over, Jaune leapt onto a broken building to get a better vantage point. He was looking for the largest concentration of Grimm, his braking that would crush any further resistance the Grimm could put up. It took him little time to locate his intended target. A Berengal surrounded by a pack of Beowulfs that were currently rampaging through Atlesian droids. Smirking, Jaune performed another telekinetic leap, jumping across the battlefield and into combat with the Grimm. As Jaune landed, he brought Crocea Morse down with him, slashing and killing a Beowulf as he entered the fray. The older, and more experienced Berengal immediately assessed Jaune to be a major threat, and threw its fist at him, hoping to catch him before he had a chance to guard. Before the strike hit, however, Jaune merely waved his hand and a Beowulf he telekinetically grabbed onto flew to intercept. Jaune's grim meat shield literally exploded from the force of the Berengal's punch, creating a fine mist of darkness that served to cover Jaune's movements. The Berengal swung wildly once more, bringing both its arms above its head and smashing downward, breaking the concrete as Jaune sidestepped the attack entirely. With a flash of his blade, Jaune countered by severing the gorilla's arm, Crocea Morse easily slicing through the thick muscle and bone of the Grimm. The Berengal stepped back, roaring in pain as it lifted its stump into the air, bleeding dark miasma. And Jaune would give it no time to recover. As the Grimm stumbled back, Jaune flung his sword right for the monster. The tip of Crocea Morse skewered the Berengal's jaw, exiting out the back of its neck. But Jaune wasn't finished yet, as letting the Grimm simply bleed to death would be too merciful. So Jaune then leapt into the air once more, landing atop the Berengal's shoulders. Gripping Crocea Morse with his right hand, Jaune then sent a torrent of lightning into the weapon, turning it into a lightning rod that cooked the inside of the Berengal. The Berengal spasmed and shook as the electricity coursed through its body. Nearby Beowulfs were tentatively backing away from the display of power, when the Berengal's body exploded. The Grimm's form, no longer able to contain the energy within, burst like a balloon as arcs of electricity shot outward, striking all of the nearby Beowulfs, killing them all instantly. Jaune fell down to the ground, surrounded by dissipating corpses as the combined forces of Baal and Atlas surged forward while the Grimm were in full retreat. The battle was all but over, and continuing to chase down the smaller bands of Grimm was a superfluous action. He had stopped the Grimm attack, and could help but close his eyes and smile as he successfully protected his friends. Standing amongst the pile of dissolving corpses, Jaune couldn't help but feel fulfilled. Jaune. A high-pitched voice called out that could only belong to Ruby Rose. Jaune had lost track of the younger huntress during the battle, but it seems that she was okay despite being worse for wear. Like her teammates, she was covered in small injuries and her outfit rather disheveled, but she seemed to ignore her state as she ran up to Jaune while Atlas continued to secure the area. Jaune, I saw that Berengal explode. Are you okay? Ruby asked, worried for her fellow leader's state. Jaune let himself take in the atmosphere of the battle for a few more moments first, before slowly turning to Ruby with a smile, his eyes opening to reveal now sickly yellow-tinted irises. Ruby, I have never felt better in my life.